Welcome to the Atheist Podcast. I'm Erin.
And I'm Kelly. Atheist is where we will explore American cultural trends through the lenses of a devout theist
And a devout atheist. We will discuss the messiness of being human.
The latest in social science, psychology, and American culture.
And what any of it has to do with Homo sapiens' longtime preoccupation with religion. Hey, Kelly.
Hey, Erin.
How's it going?
It's pretty good. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm very excited. We've got two guests in the studio today, so that's always exciting.
That is exciting. We have Jim and Rich here today who are going to talk to us about centering prayer. So we had David here a couple episodes ago, and David was talking to us about 12 steps, and part of the 12 steps is the 11th step, which is through prayer and meditation. Can you guys finish
Sought
it for me?
through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood God.
Thank you.
Praying only for knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out.
Yes. Thank you, Rich. So centering prayer, there's all kinds of ways to do 11 step, but centering prayer is one of the ways. And that's one of the ways that David practices 11 step. And I also practice centering prayer, and I came to centering prayer not through the 12 steps, but through kind of a call to find a more contemplative prayer life. And it's been really powerful for me. So I'm super excited that Jim and Rich are here, and we're going to talk about centering prayer.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi, you guys.
Hey.
Hello?
Do you want to tell us a little bit about how you both know each other and kind of how...
Yeah, a little bit about yourselves.
And a little bit about yourselves?
Yeah. Well, I think I met Rich probably 25 years ago. I mean, would you say, Rich?
32.
32 years ago? Oh, my God. Goodness gracious. And we met at a meeting.
Yeah.
And I always liked what Rich, shared at meetings. I just liked Rich. He's a funny guy, great perspective on recovery. And, we've been really friends ever since then. And we've shared meetings together. We've shared just a lot together. And then I guess, probably about 12 or 13 years ago, would you say, Rich? I was doing an intro workshop on centering prayer, giving that with a couple other people at the Step Solano Club in St. Louis on Humphrey. And Rich came to that workshop. And, it was just a basic intro workshop that we give to, people in recovery on the 11th step, like you say. And it stuck with Rich. I mean, it was like something he was really interested in. I think it came at, I'll let Rich speak for himself, but it came at a kind of a great time in his life, like it came at an important time in my life. Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the things about taking an intro workshop. It's like somehow, it's just like the time, it has to all work. It's like people recognize a need. It's not like you wake up one morning and think, oh, I'm going to start practicing centering prayer. It's like, usually it comes from some type of a need. Yeah. And so I'll let Rich talk a little bit. Yeah.
Well, I've been in recovery since 92 and kind of had an 11-step practice of reading meditation books in the morning and stuff. I still remember when I got out of treatment is I told they're giving you all sorts of things that might help you learn to relax and recover. And I said, they said meditation. I said, oh yeah, that'd be great. I'll do meditation. And I said, can I do like a half hour a day? And the guy says, no, maybe like 2 or 3 minutes is all you're going to be able to handle. And so what happened at this workshop I went to, this was in June of 2011, is I was disabused of the notion of what meditation meant. And what I had an idea of what meditation was supposed to be like is a drug-like blissful experience.
Yeah.
And so what happened was over the years, whenever I tried to meditate, my mind kept going. And I thought, well, I'm not doing it right. So I just didn't do it. And so at that first workshop, that was one of the main things I took away from it was that what happens in the 20 minutes is not as important I mean, so if your mind goes the whole time, that's fine. You say this word, and we'll talk more about that. I got rid of the idea of thinking of this as some experience that's supposed to happen. And what they said is basically God will work through those 20 minutes the way God sees fit, whether you're noisy or not, whether you're quiet or not, whether any of that. And that the real benefit of the practice is in your regular life. Your daily life.
Yeah. The
And
fruits.
that
Yeah.
has been true. So I started, and I took to it. I took to it the way I took to recovery. I was really ready, and started doing the 2 meditations a day, and then got trained to give workshops about 3 or 4 years after that, and so kind of continues that way
Yeah.
this day.
Well, I think that's so interesting that you said, that it comes, this isn't just like what everybody starts doing when they enter a 12-step program. So
No.
centering prayer comes at the time when you need centering prayer. And that was my experience too. It was when I think back on it, it was such a weird thing. Like I had no basis for, like, I don't know why my heart was even longing for like some kind of contemplative practice, but I kept going to the Centering Prayer website, the Centering Prayer of St. Louis website, or the Contemplative Outreach, which is the kind of the overarching organization. And I kept going to it, and I kept looking at it for like months. And then finally I went one weekend to one of the intro workshops, and it was like a 2-day kind of intro workshop. And I remember, I think my parents were visiting at the time, and so they had one of my cars. And so my husband drove me there and picked me up. And when he picked me up afterwards, I got in the car and I just started weeping. It was like my heart just knew this is what I needed. And I didn't really know anything about it. I didn't know why. So it feels like a definite kind of divinely led place or practice, but not that it has to be. Like, hopefully, as people listen to this today, I think, it might tug on your heart a little bit and maybe invite you, or just even plant a seed that maybe 5 years, 10 years down the road. Right?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. So I know you both teach centering prayer, and I know you probably start with kind of the origin stories of centering prayer. And so I was wondering if you could kind of give, because it's a pretty interesting story.
Right.
So why don't I start, and I'll pass it off to you after Vatican II.
Perfect.
Right. So there's all of the different religions have contemplative practices, mystical practices, and they're often led by people who don't like the way they see the organization of the religion going. So they leave and they go somewhere else, and they form communities, and they start trying to get back to a pure practice of the religion as they would believe. So this begins in Christianity from the very start. In the first couple hundred years, the desert mothers and fathers would leave, primarily in Egypt and in North Africa as the main places these were. And then
So they were kind of fleeing empire to go find community.
right. Well, as the Catholic Church became more and more involved with the Roman Empire, and by the 3rd century, it became the state religion in Rome, and people saw all sorts of problems with that, from its traditional Christian beginnings of small communities, kind of socialist communities, kind of that thing. But when they saw them involved in government and empire and power, these people would leave. And so this was kind of the tradition. After the fall of the Roman Empire, I think it's about the 6th century that St. Benedict writes the rule for monasteries. And so by then there's bunches of different groups of priests, nuns, and things that are leaving to go live in secluded communities where they're responsible for make a living, and they practice prayer and chanting X number of hours a day. They work the rest of the time, and they have vows of poverty and obedience and things. So that's really starts in the 6th century, hugely in Europe, and so the monastic movement, it's called. And he writes the Order of St. Benedict, this book, and this kind of sets up the daily routine and the rules of this. And most of the monasteries to this day still follow those in the different religious Christian orders. The next thing, as far as centering prayer, there was a monk, I don't know if he was Franciscan or what, in England. Somebody wrote a book called The Cloud of Unknowing. And The Cloud of Unknowing sets out what becomes the basics of what we're going to talk about today, centering prayer. It's all in this book.
And wasn't it the first kind of Christian book written in English, or the first spiritual
Probably.
text written in English?
Yeah, I don't know if it was in English or in Latin, but it was 14th century, so maybe translated into English right away.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. But when I think the monks in the 20th century were starting to rely on that book, and Jim will pick this up after Vatican II. So, Christianity then, with the fall of the Middle Ages and the Enlightenment, Christianity is involved in all sorts of power politics and things in Europe. So the practices are largely unknown until in the 1960s, Vatican II came, where the Church said they needed to. I think Pope John the 23rd said they need to open the windows and air this place out. And so that involved all sorts of changes, like from Latin to English in services and in the way the services were conducted, but also in the way that people were to pray. And so, which leads us to this monk, Thomas Keating, preceding that is Thomas Merton, who's probably the biggest contemplative writer of the last century. And Merton began writing a lot about this in the 1940s and 50s. He was at a monastery called Gethsemane outside of Louisville, and very influential. And he was a Trappist monk, as was Thomas Keating. And Thomas Keating had been in the monastery since 1940, 41. And he's an interesting guy because he went in and he was like a pretty severe, he wanted the most severe order possible. And when Vatican II came in and they had to open up things and they had to change, he really struggled with holding the line on the really strict practices. I mean, back then monks hardly, in the Trappists, would not talk at all. It was all signals.
The grand silence.
Yeah. And so this leads us to like the 1970s, the 60s movement, and Thomas Monk is an abbot. He's in charge of this monastery in Spencer, Massachusetts. And Jim will pick it up here.
Yeah, Thomas Keating. Thomas Keating was actually born in, I think, 1923. He died in 2018. And he was a very gifted man, came from a very privileged family, great education, but like Rich said, he's just like this lifelong desire to be a contemplative. I mean, he wanted to, that was his calling in life.
His parents were totally secular, atheist, and he would like, this is how's this. He would sneak off to go to church as a kid. Not many of them are around.
There's a great documentary about his life.
It's called A Rising Tide of Silence, and you can actually see it on YouTube. It's really worth seeing. It's beautiful. It's beautiful done. It's about his entire life. So anyway, the monastery recognized Thomas's gifts, and he was elected to be the abbot. And like Rich was talking about in Vatican II, he came back and he had this idea that they needed to start teaching contemplative prayer. And how do we do that? Well, down the street from Spencer, Massachusetts, where he was the abbot, there was a Buddhist temple, and they would notice all these people, the young people, going over to this Buddhist hippies, the 1960s, 1970s, looking for this transcendent spiritual experience. And it dawned on these guys, we have that too. We have a contemplative dimension. And it was actually when they started teaching this, a lot of people who maybe had fallen away from the church, they liked the connection of meditation and going back to their Christian roots. Which a lot of people had fallen away from in the 1960s. They were done with traditional going to church on Sundays and just hearing like the box of spirituality. And so at first, I will say Thomas Keating, Basil Pennington, William Menninger, their idea initially was really to teach religious people this. I mean, that's really, I mean, they started doing retreats and inviting non-religious people, but I think their original vision was, we'll teach it in the seminaries, we'll teach it to religious people, and that's how it'll spread. Well, it actually, I mean, they did that initially. They did some of that, and I think successfully, but it was the lay people, it was the everyday people who really started to be on fire. And what happened essentially was in 1983, Thomas by this time had retired as the abbot in Spencer, Massachusetts, and retired to Snowmass, Colorado, when he was in his early 60s. And he was asked at a couple of local parishes near Snowmass to give introductory workshops to centering prayer. And then he had this idea, or it was presented to him, to do this novel idea of this experiment of inviting lay people to a retreat, which was done in Taos, New Mexico at the Lama Foundation.
I did not know that.
Yeah, and invited, I think, about 15 or 20 people. And his experiment was, can people who have this, who've not had a religious background, how would they react to extended periods of silence? How would they handle it? And these are people like Gail Fitzpatrick Hopler, David Frenette, Bill Sheehan. All these people, they eventually became leaders in the Mary Mrzowski. I could go on, but these people eventually became. These were like.
And they were at Lama?
They were at the Lama Foundation. And it was like a watershed transforming experience. Like these people came out of that experience. And Thomas had put together a series of talks for this experience. And these became the basis of the Spiritual Journey videotapes, which you can now see on our website, the Contemplative Outreach website. They're
like on YouTube too.
They're on YouTube as well. Yeah, there's a Contemplative Outreach channel on YouTube. But if you just type in the Spiritual Journey Centering Prayer Tapes, Thomas Keating, you can see, and there's like, I don't know how, I think there may be 36 talks. I don't know exactly how many, but there are a lot of talks. And Thomas takes you through, the whole spiritual journey. There are absolutely, including how to do centering prayer. And it's just lovely. So with this experience, it was like, that was in 83. In 1984, Contemplative Outreach was chartered. It was formed, and it started from there. That, and as I said, initially they wanted to teach it to religious, but more and more they saw the real hunger for this was in everyday life, in parishes, out of parishes. Just everyday people were really attracted to centering prayer. So
I'm curious how, and I know here in St. Louis, 12 Steps. There's centering prayer is an offering, like you said. You teach it as an 11-step
yes
practice, and I'm wondering, is there an official connection between Contemplative Outreach and 12-step programs, or how did that connection?
It's a great question. There is a connection because we have an organization called 12-Step Outreach, which is actually a sector of Contemplative Outreach now.
Okay.
Because a lot of people within Contemplative Outreach, a lot of them are in recovery, various programs, all the different 12-step programs, and they utilize centering prayer as their 11-step practice. Yeah. And the way that really came about was just, people in recovery, I think by nature, were people who are seekers. And there were a handful of people and a growing number of people who were finding out about centering prayer. And they thought, boy, they have, this this would be cool if we could teach centering prayer as an 11-step practice, because the bottom line is, in all the 12-step literature, there's not a lot of guidance on a method for meditation. I mean, we talk about it in the 12 and 12. They use the St. Francis prayer as kind of a model and like reflecting on those words, kind of like a Lectio Divina type thing. But there's really not a method. And
Most of the things in the big book and the 12 and 12 book are about the prayer practice and about like certain things you start your day with and end your day with.
Right.
And a lot of that is like personal inventory, like how did the day go? Do I owe anybody an amends? That kind of stuff.
Right.
But nothing really on meditation.
Yeah.
It's really focused on the prayer part of it, I think.
So that leads me to the question too, like, well, two questions. One, this doesn't have to be, because in AA, you certainly don't have to be a Christian to be in AA.
no.
Right? And so to practice centering prayer, you don't have to.
No.
No,
Yeah,
there's no.
Well, I was actually looking at the pamphlet, and it says this is true whether we call the power God, Allah, Mother, another name, or no name.
Right.
Yeah,
So
there's-
I mean, the genius of Bill Wilson back in the 1930s was he somehow intuitively knew that alcoholics hate authority, and want to fight, and that the less that they were giving top down on what people needed to believe, the better. And that's where he came up with God as you understand him. Now, most of those guys in the early days were Christian, Protestants mostly.
Yeah.
You know, but that God as you understand him saved more people. So that there's plenty of atheists in 12-step
Yeah.
stuff now. It's not any thing. And the way that centering prayer operated, like there's a workshop, a contemplative outreach workshop and a centering prayer 12-step outreach workshop. The only difference is the talks 1 and 4, where they kind of mention Jesus and a couple things in the contemplative outreach one. In the 12-step outreach, they just say God as you understand him.
Okay,
They
I
just
see.
changed the language. That's what Keating allowed, was changing the language of those things.
Okay.
And I think he learned a lot from the 12-step people.
Yeah.
And he was open enough to see the possibility here.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I would even say, I don't want to quote Thomas Keating here, but I would say that he considered the 12 steps and Alcoholics Anonymous in particular as the greatest spiritual movement of the last century.
Yeah.
I mean, he was very respectful. Many of his talks, which you can see on YouTube, if you never had the opportunity to get to know Thomas Keating, there's unlimited amount of videos and tapes and that you can see right on YouTube. And I know a lot of people who feel like they know Thomas Keating, although they never got to meet him.
Yeah.
I was one of the fortunate ones who got to spend quite a bit of time with him over the years.
Did
Oh,
you?
wow.
Yeah, I was lucky.
Did you go to snow? You went to Snow Mass?
Yeah, like there was we started meeting with Thomas in the very early 2000s. I think it would be kind of interesting just to tell a little bit of background, and we
Yeah.
can certainly. But I started out, just doing through contemplative outreach. I mean,
Yeah.
there was no connection to me between, I was doing like 12-step over here and then contemplative outreach over here, and didn't really ever even think about it,
Huh.
that much of connecting it. But what happened was there's a gentleman by the name of Matt F., and he was involved with Thomas Keating, like at Snow Mass. He was actually a chef in Aspen and got to know Thomas pretty well. And when Matt moved from Snow Mass back to St. Louis, he immediately got involved in the local contemplative outreach chapter and eventually became a chapter coordinator here. And Matt was in recovery and also had a deep love of centering prayer, and the monks out there, and and Matt in the 1990s got to know a guy by the name of Donald Masters. And Donald is no longer on the planet, but he was a very successful attorney in Denver, Colorado. And Donald had a struggle with sobriety. He was kind of in and out of sobriety for a long time, but he always knew that spirituality was the answer for his malady, and started going to these retreats in Snowmass, Colorado. And he's the one who probably initially talked to Thomas Keating about, what about teaching centering prayer as an 11-step practice? That's where this conversation really started. So when Matt Flatley came back to St. Louis in 2000, he set up a retreat and invited Donald Masters, who had this relationship with Thomas Keating and was by this time teaching centering prayer. He invited him to come and give this retreat. And we had about 25 people in recovery come. It was at the Marianist Retreat Center out in Eureka, Missouri. And Donald Masters came and gave us this retreat. And I'll tell you, up until that point, I really didn't have much of a connection between the two organizations, but that night, Donald Masters got up there and he on a Friday night, and he basically told a story. And what he said was, he's a Vietnam vet. He's a real handsome guy, really an impressive, really good speaker. And he got up there and he said, I'm a Vietnam vet. I suffer from PTSD. And he said, and I've got chronic pain. And I've got all kinds of issues in my life. He goes, and I started going to the monastery, and he goes, one time I went up to Thomas Keating and I said, Thomas, I've got, I struggle with centering prayer. He said, I know this is an answer for me. And Thomas said, well, Donald, tell me about your practice. Tell me what you do with your centering prayer. And Donald Masters said, I sit down, I close my eyes, I introduce the sacred word. And he said, what happens for me is I have all these images from my PTSD. He said, I have pain in my body. My back hurts. He goes, I'm miserable when I sit down there, when I sit down in centering prayer. And he goes, I try to wait 15, 20 minutes. I try to return to my centering prayer. I try to follow the guidelines. But he said, it's just a painful experience. And Thomas Keating said to him, Donald, I'd like you to try something. And he said, I'd like you to try using your pain as your sacred word. And Donald Masters said, in that moment when Thomas said those words, he realized that all of his life, he had been trying to avoid pain. He'd been running from pain all of his life, whether it be through alcohol, pills, therapy. It was always trying. And he said, when Thomas said those words, he said, I realized that there was another way to experience pain and suffering in one's life.
Just because people won't know what that means, but the idea in centering prayer is you use this sacred word when you're engaged with your thoughts, right? And that can be any number of things. It could be physically you're feeling things and you just can't stop thinking about them, like this example. And the word represents your intention to consent to God's presence and action within. That's the sole use of the word. It's not a mantra in like a TM kind of sense. It's not something you're supposed to repeat. You're supposed to do it when your
thoughts kind of hijack
right.
you.
So basically what Keating was saying is you need to consent to what's happening with you.
Yeah.
You need to consent. You need to say yes. You need to acknowledge. You need to accept reality.
Yeah.
And all of that.
Yeah.
And as you do, God is in that with you. That's kind of what his breakthrough was, I think.
That's exactly what it was, Rich. Thank you for clarifying that. That's exactly what it was. And I'm sitting there on this Friday night of this meditation workshop, and I'm like just absorbing this. I thought, God, I want that guy as my teacher. I mean, because we've all had childhood pain, trauma experiences. I mean, especially in 12-step recovery. I mean, that's why we're there. We're medicating. We're medicating something. That's why we're there.
Yeah.
Most of it's pain, But when he said, there's another way to experience pain. We don't have to fight it anymore.
Yeah.
And he was able to kind of surrender to that and let it become a part of his experience, And really that's when it was born in my life.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
when that's when I knew that centering
That
prayer was going to be
connection.
my practice. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The remedy is the experience.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Well said. Yeah.
There's I did the living school with Richard Rohr. It was very, very cool. And I have my brother who was in recovery to thank for that, because he's the one who introduced me to Rohr through breathing underwater. But one of the things one of the biggest things that I took away from all of that was, I remember this one class, he said, reality is the greatest ally of God. And so it just reminds me, like what you were just saying, Rich, like, yeah, like we cannot avoid what is. Like,
Yeah.
And so, people who think that meditation is supposed to take us out of our reality, like that's absolutely not it. It brings us right into what is real. And that is where I think the divine is.
I think you're right. And I think, we can say it a bunch of different ways, but I think what Donald Masters recognized with all his life, he'd been resisting
Right.
that emotional and physical pain. And he knew that there was another way, which was to embrace it.
Yeah.
And that's what transformed it, just like what Rich said,
And I think too that, or something I think Keating recognized was that, especially in AA, anybody with drug and alcohol problems, that they have had to face reality
Yeah.
Yeah.
in a way that most people
Yeah. Can avoid.
can avoid,
Yeah.
or are avoiding, whatever.
Yeah.
And that, and for me, that it was an easy transition for me to centering prayer. It was 20 years later.
Yeah.
I didn't do it for 20 years.
Right.
But when it came to it, I saw the connection. And one of the things about centering prayer, that idea that it's not in the 20 minutes is what happens. And that, so there's a lot of people, the sixth and seventh step in AA is like being entirely ready to remove your character defects and humbly asking God to remove them, right? And so people have stacks of self-help books. And people do this all the time, And I had my stack of those. And what I realized is with this centering prayer is the idea most people in AA are working to fix their own character defects. And they only get worse. They only get worse because you're the one trying to fix
Yeah.
the problem, and you're the problem.
Right.
And what centering prayer, one of the things it did for me is it kind of said, you know what? I'm turning this all over to God.
Yeah.
So God, you
do it.
you got the character defects. You take care of
Yeah.
it. Remove what you want. If you don't want it
Yeah.
removed, it stays. And this is so much easier way to live. It just says, all right, well, if you really believe God is everything, then let God do the work. And you just show up twice a day. Do this 20 minutes twice a day. Let God do the rest of it.
And don't worry about it.
I'm
Stay out of
basically
it.
lazy. Yeah,
Yeah.
that was it. It has.
It's like the laziest spiritual practice ever.
And the other thing that's important is that, so the third step is turn your will and life over to the care of God, and that always trips up people. Oh, God, what does that mean? And all that stuff. Basically, it means, you don't know what the hell you're doing. Just keep going with the steps. Do the rest of the stuff. Do your inventory. Do all this. And, this sixth and the third step is this thing, and I don't know what, for some reason, very early on, I just said, oh, well, this is like a third step. So these 20 minutes are God's
Okay. Yeah.
twice a day, and I sit down, I do the 20 minutes. I don't, no matter if it's quiet or not quiet, doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's God's. And when you do the sacred word and you're consenting, in AA lingo, you're turning it over to God. Turning it over, you're turning it over, you're turning it over. That can't help but translate in the other parts of your day.
Yeah.
If you've sat for 20 minutes and consented to God's help 50 times in 20 minutes,
that
it can't
becomes
help.
a muscle.
It becomes, as Cynthia Peugeot calls it, the aerobic muscle of surrender.
Yeah.
Right? And so that's been very compatible. So I always say, when I do centering prayer, I'm doing the second step, third step, 6, 7, and 11.
Yeah.
I'm doing them all at the same time.
Yeah. Nice.
And it's much.
So I think probably at this point, people who are listening are like, how do we do this?
Can I just say
Yeah.
one thing?
Yeah, of course.
We talked about, do you have to believe in God or do you have to be a
Yeah.
Christian? I'd like to say something about that. Just, one of the special outreaches, I'll say, that Thomas Keating had was he taught this in prisons. He went to Folsom Prison. There's some wonderful videos of Thomas Keating that you can see. Thomas Keating, Folsom Prison. You can YouTube that. In prison, it's what Thomas taught. What we teach is a method.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a simple method. It's not a belief system. It's not a religion. In fact, I think Thomas would say most people with a lot of beliefs have to get rid of those beliefs. They have to get rid, and maybe there's an advantage to people who have an atheistic more point of view, because we all have to give rid of those ideas of God and religion that we grew up with, because they just don't work forever. They worked maybe when we were children and they helped us, but we are called to have a new vision of spirituality in our connection. That's what we're really called to. So I just kind of wanted to say that again too.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah. So
Hence unknowing, right? The cloud
yeah,
of
exactly.
unknowing.
Yeah, exactly. And God as we understand him, it's like,
Yeah.
or maybe God as we don't understand him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
So, okay. So I want to sit down and I want to do centering prayer.
Yeah.
How do I do it?
Okay.
So the first thing you do
Yeah.
is you choose a sacred word as the symbol of your intention to consent to God's presence and action within.
Okay.
Right? So you pick a word.
Okay.
Pick a word.
I got my word.
Usually a short word.
Yep.
Usually one that's not loaded with baggage. Like you don't want to use mom.
Right. Right.
You don't want to use that. So
Do you keep your sacred word secret?
no, it doesn't have to
Okay.
be. You can, and the fact is that the sacred. I've had the same one at home. I've had it for
Yeah.
the whole time I've been doing it.
Yeah.
In the beginning, it kind of has meaning to you. You
Yeah.
pick it, but it doesn't mean anything now except for this consent thing
Right.
that takes place. So you pick a word.
Yeah.
That's number one. All
And
right?
what does that mean? Consent to
God's presence and
presence and action within.
Wide open.
Yeah.
Because it's all about your intention. That's what it's about. It's the whole thing is based on your intention to consent, to God's presence and action within, or however you want to define that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. We just interviewed actually a couple days ago a theologian who wrote a book called The Theology of Consent.
Love that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was really good. It was really interesting. He's a scholar of Mimetic Theory and
Open relational theology. And the idea is that if God is love, then God cannot be controlling because it's not within God's, you can't be loving and control somebody at the same time. So God's nature so our relationship with God has to be a relationship of consent.
Wow.
Right.
Yeah.
So it just is lovely that is,
So-
the word.
Yeah, so I pulled up here. This is one of Merton's most famous prayers, and it says, "My Lord God, I have no idea where I am going. I do not see the road ahead of me. I cannot know for certain where it will end, nor do I really know myself. And the fact that I think I am following your will does not mean I am actually doing so, but I believe that the desire to please you does in fact please you." A lot of the other meditation practices are based on attention, a mantra, something you're focusing on, mindfulness,
Anchor.
the written word, something like that. This is not that at all. So it's based on this idea of as Thomas Keating says, sit down for 20 minutes and let God introduce himself to you.
And he calls it divine therapy, right?
Yeah. Yes, he does. Yeah.
Yeah.
And basically what that is
Well, let's finish the 4 things.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Then we'll get there. Sorry, I'm rushing you. I'm
All right,
excited.
I'll do number 2. Jim will get the next 2. Sitting comfortably and with eyes closed, settle briefly and silently introduce the sacred word as the symbol of your consent to God's presence and action within. So this is all about how do you sit down? How do you get this started? Try to have a comfortable chair. Don't have a recliner because you'll fall asleep probably. And if you do fall asleep, that's okay. Anything that happens, it's okay, really, basically. But sit comfortably and then try and be in a quiet room. All the basics you would give in any meditation thing.
Yeah.
That's what the second part is.
Okay.
And then the third guideline is, when engaged with your thoughts, return ever so gently to the sacred word. And you had a question about the divine therapy, and I think this is kind of related. But so when you're engaged, when you become engaged in your thoughts, like you'll sit down, you're peaceful, you introduce the sacred word, and then inevitably you'll have a thought, am I doing it right? Did I remember to do this? What do I need to pick up at the grocery store? And then when you notice yourself thinking about your thoughts, you just return ever so gently to the sacred word. That's it. And ultimately, that is the divine therapy, because what is supposed to come into our, it's not like we're trying to get rid of our thoughts. It's not like we're trying to bat them out or repress them or get rid of them or find this perfect place of peace. It's not about that. It's about more detaching from your thoughts. It's just like we become aware, we detach, we let go, let it come, let it go. It's more that just let it flow down the stream of consciousness. And
I tell this story with that first workshop. This is like the only thing I really remember from it. Is the guy who was doing this particular one, the third one. He used an example. He says, "Imagine you're on the beach. You're sitting there, and in the distance you hear an airplane." He says, "But you're not really engaged with it." He said, "You wouldn't say the sacred word then. It's not anything. It's like if you're in a room and you hear noises in another room. You're not necessarily thinking about it or anything. The plane gets louder and louder. You're still not paying attention. But then you kind of open your eyes and it says, 'Happy 16th birthday, Lucy.' And you think to yourself, well, who is this bitch Lucy? Where does her family come up with that kind of money to do this? How come nobody did anything for me?" And that's when he says, "You're engaged.
Now you're engaged.
You're definitely
Now you're
engaged
engaged.
at that point." And then you say the word. The other famous story of Keating's was a nun came to him and said, I must be doing it wrong. I had to say the sacred word 100 times. And Keating said to her, "Oh, you returned to God 100 times. What a great thing.
beautiful,
That's
yeah.
beautiful."
Yeah.
So there's no, what do they say? It's an act of surrender, an act of love, this saying the sacred word. So there's no wrong way to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah, it's interesting too. I mean, I think even just the practice of being able to sort of, control your thoughts, or I mean, I don't even know if control is the right word, but
Hold them loosely.
Yeah,
Not
that
let
is
them
so
be triggering.
helpful for people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to be able to take that, and if it's something that you're doing over and over again every day, you're training your mind in a way to not let the things that maybe would let you run away with your thoughts in a way that would be really unhelpful. Like you're training people to have a better, mental space just in every part of their life.
absolutely. Yeah,
Richard
absolutely.
Rohr,
It's a flow.
Richard Rohr says we're addicted to our thinking.
Yeah.
We're just addicted to our own, and we think everything we think is right. And this thing just gives space between
Yeah.
the thought and reality,
Yeah,
maybe.
yeah.
So
I love that.
So that third guideline again is, when engaged with your thoughts, return ever so gently to the sacred word. And then at the end of the prayer period, remain in silence with eyes closed for a couple of minutes. So I'd just like to say a couple of things. I think the whole movement of centering prayer is about opening ourselves up to God's unconditional love for each of us, and most of us in our society, we don't have that. We're not aware of that in our daily lives. Oh, God loves me, but, like in 12-step recovery, when you look at the 12th step, having had a spiritual awakening, Christians will say, "I've been saved." The Buddhists will say, "I've reached enlightenment." I think Thomas Keating, the words that he would like to use is like transforming union. And what he means by that is, just this, you ask about what is divine therapy. The divine therapy is twofold. One, it is recognizing that divinity within each of us. It's like really supporting and nurturing that, God's goodness within each and every one of us. And the second thing is letting go of those blocks that keep us from that awareness.
Yeah.
And when we have a thought, when something comes up, or maybe it's a physical pain or whatever comes into our awareness, as we return ever so gently to the sacred word, we're letting it go. We're letting it go. We're going a little bit deeper. I'll just a really quick analogy that I like to use, and that is, like if we are sick, physically sick, our body finds way to get rid of things, either, sitting on the pot or throwing up, that's the way our physical body gets rid of toxins, right? Or stuff that we're not supposed to have in our bodies. Well, the psyche has the same thing, our being has the same thing, and that is awareness and letting go. Anything that's down there that's preventing our awareness of God's presence eventually is released in this process, and we feel more at home in ourselves, I would say. But that transforming union is really what this is about.
And in the way, I mean, one of the things they'll say is about not judging the 20-minute period, because you're not in charge of it, really. Who knows what God's doing in the 20 minutes, and that's also true in the long term. So if you've been doing this for 8 years and nothing's going on with it, and you don't think anything's going on, you still do it. You still go ahead and do it, because what do you know?
Right.
You're trying to take charge of the whole process again. So, like I've been doing it 13, 14 years, and like a friend of mine in the program has been doing it 20 years, and I know she has a deeper thing than I do. And only because she's had incredibly painful things happen in the last several years, and she's continued to do it, and she's continued to not have consolation with it, but she trusts God. It's that deep in her that she trusts God. I'm not there, and at most of the time, and that's perfectly fine. If I get there 20 years, that'd be great. But everybody's path is individual with it, and.
But how beautiful to be committed to something that we don't demand results immediately, right? That we can say, I trust this, and it's actually, it's not really even my business whether it's kind of working or not. I'm just going to trust it.
Trust the mystery.
It's a faith in God at a level that is beyond anything I've was ever taught about or anything like that. It's and I feel like I know God less now, but I trust more.
Yeah.
Trust the process.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, and I do think when you kind of start that contemplative, and because, so one of the things when I do a sit, I have an image, and there's this artist, watercolor artist, and she does this watercolors. They're kind of just black and gray, and so it's just black, white, gray, and white. And she usually does children with animals and different scenarios. And this one picture is the picture of a little boy, and his back is facing to us, and then facing him, and also facing us, is this huge bull that's just with these horns. And the bull is kind of laying down, so the bull's nose is right at the same level with the little boy's face. And I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think of what the name of the painting is. If it's Silence, but to me, that's the presence of God. That just being in that kind of childlike, I'm just here. I'm not going to try to control this. I'm just going to consent. And then this magnificent, unknowable creature being in relationship with.
Right.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Kelly, I'm so glad you gave us that image, because it's something. It reminds me of something that we always talk about a sacred word. But I just want to, for the listeners here, I also want to say that some people don't really identify with the sacred word. Some people, it might be the breath. Maybe they've been trained in another.
Some people are visual learners.
Yeah.
Or visual learners, or, like you, like that image, when you start thinking about your thoughts or you get engaged with your thoughts, returning to that image, what you described, that is your consent.
Yeah.
That is your consent.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be real perfect or fine. It can be a generalized gaze, but also, the breath, or really, it can be any sensation. It can really be any sensation. Yeah.
Yeah, that's helpful. That's really helpful.
Yeah.
Erin, do you have any?
No, this is very interesting. I mean, I tend to, for me, like when I observe all the different religious traditions, I'm always I gravitate to things that I feel like are common among the wisdom traditions. And it clearly, a meditative practice is something that is beneficial to people all across different cultures, different religions. This was not one that I was particularly familiar with, so it's really interesting to learn about it, and I appreciate you guys sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you.
I went to that. Have you ever been to the Vedanta Society there? I went one time. This is the only thing I remember that. This is 30 years ago. The guy was ancient who'd been there, and he came and he said, "What is difference between Jewish mystic, Christian mystic, Muslim mystic, Buddhist mystic, Hindu mystic? What is the difference between them?" "Nothing at all." He started laughing. The same thing.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, that perennial tradition.
That perennial tradition.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, and what you were also mentioning, just that I think I know God less, or unknowing, what we have to unknow about our, what we're taught about God. This idea that, and again, this is a Rohrism, but this idea that the more kind of that God is not unknowable, but endlessly knowable, and this idea that kind of the more we see, the more we realize the bigger the picture is, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And
And I think that, getting into AA, that was one of those things, because, you would have, I realized right away, because God gets talked about a good deal of the time, but I realized people have all sorts of conceptions of this stuff, much larger than I was thinking about. And do you know David Foster Wallace? He's got a great line from Infinite Jest, because he talks a lot about AA in Boston. And he says, in any given AA meeting in Boston, at any given point, 58% of the people believe that God will give them a parking space. and this drives the other 42% insane.
Oh, that's so funny. Well, and that just brings up too, just the idea that when we think about prayer, what we think about is petitionary prayer. We're praying for a parking spot. We're praying to get that house we're applying for, or, the apartment. And this is not that.
It's not. Yeah. It's more of an opening.
Yeah.
It's an opening of ourselves. But it is prayer. I mean, it is prayer. And God honors all prayer. I mean, we know that. But I think this is a transformative practice. And I would just like to say, did you want to do a little centering prayer, or do we have time for that?
I think we do.
Let's do it.
Yeah, okay.
I think we do.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it should be at least 5 minutes.
Okay, I agree.
So Thomas, I'll throw this out, but it won't count for what we're doing today. Is that he said, somebody came up to him and said, what if I can only do 10 minutes? He says, well, that's great. Just do 10 minutes. You just can't call that centering prayer.
So actually, and we should mention too, centering prayer is typically done twice a day for 20 minutes.
20 minutes. Some would say 20 to 30 minutes, but you're right, 20 minutes a day.
Yeah.
And I'll say this also. There is a chapter of Contemplative Outreach in St. Louis. I know you have probably a wide listenership audience, but there's a Contemplative Outreach website, Contemplative Outreach LTD. And there's 12-step outreach. It's cp12stepoutreach.org. And if you want to find out more about contemplative outreach
And there's
and
another
centering prayer.
Yeah, another Keating story is the woman came up to him and said, I can't do this twice a day. I've got kids, I've got this, I've got that. And he says, okay, well, don't do it twice a day. You need to do it 3 times a day.
Yeah, right.
The idea being, and anybody who has a meditation practice, no matter what kind, you are more efficient.
Yeah.
Your time is
yes.
doing the 20 minutes twice a day.
Yeah.
You're going to be more efficient in the other hours of the
Yeah.
day.
Yeah.
That's
Yep.
what he's getting at there,
Yeah.
is that
Yeah.
this is not.
Rich, can we use a gong on the phone? Do you?
Oh, good idea. I was actually going to bring my
Your-
bowl, but I
Yeah.
didn't.
Yeah.
All right, so I'll do.
Yeah, it's interesting the comment that you were just making. So for me, like running is a very meditative practice,
Yeah.
and that's totally how I feel about it. It's like if I don't do that, I feel like I'm less effective in the
Yeah.
other
Yeah.
parts of my day. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it is a meditative practice. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, let's start off with an hour. Let's do an hour.
I'm hoping that now that I'm retired, I can actually get to my 2 20-minute sits because, that's it. It feels like a lot, but
All right, so I'll read the
Guidelines.
4 guidelines again, and
Okay.
then just ring the bell, and we'll go 5 minutes. All right.
okay.
Yeah.
All right. Choose a sacred word as the symbol of your intention to consent to God's presence and action within. Sitting comfortably and with eyes closed, settle briefly and silently introduce the sacred word as the symbol of your consent to God's presence and action within. 3. When engaged with your thoughts, return ever so gently to the sacred word. 4. At the end of the prayer period, remain in silence with eyes closed for a couple minutes.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Rich.
Thank you,
Thanks for
Kelly.
having
Thank you,
us.
Erin.
Yeah, this was great.
A huge heartfelt thank you to all of our listeners. Some of you joined us a year ago, some of you joined us recently, but all of you are helping us grow the show. Thank you so much.
Atheist is still advertising free, sponsor free, and available for free to everyone. Lots of podcasts have big production teams. Our team is just 3 friends working together to make something we hope puts good into the world and brings value to your life.
But we always need your help. Please spread the word and share the show. All of our social links and other ways to support the show are available on atheistpodcast.com.
Atheist is produced by Justin Sywell of Trend Media, STL. Thank you for listening, and keep looking for connection.